skies will be filled with the greatest air armada the world has ever seen. Our own Army Air Forces, the best planes ever built, 65,000 planes this year. And by the time you finish your training, America will have overwhelming superiority in the air.
Well, thank you, Bill, for the introduction, and thanks, folks, for coming out. I know it's the middle of Christmas shopping, and we don't have a flying day to bring people out, so really appreciate that you came out for what is effectively a talk on industrial policy. So, again, great to see you all. My name's Les Doggerel. I have degrees, in addition to being a lead docent here, degrees in engineering, business, and history, and in addition, 40 years experience working government defense acquisition on topics like this one. And so this topic is actually a passion of mine, something that I researched as much for personal curiosity as anything. And picture up there, you see the B-24 heavy bombers and the P-51s. This one is from Big Week, but these are the aircraft that really broke the back of the Luftwaffe. And why is this topic important? Bill kind of hinted at it, but any serious discussion of why the Allies prevailed in World War II really needs to address this topic. You know, we have heroes and battles and all of that, but this is certainly one of the key reasons why the Allies won the war. In fact, there's a quote there at the bottom by a guy you're going to hear more about, Big Bill Knudsen. But when asked that very question, that was his answer, right? We smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production. And that's the first part of it, and that's what we're going to really focus on. But the second part is also interesting in that the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible, right? Literally, the Axis powers, Hitler, Germany, did not think that what the U.S. achieved could be done. And so if you get interesting questions like, why would Germany declare war on the U.S.? They didn't know about this. And so that's what we're going to go into a little bit today. Mostly going to focus on aircraft. Woohoo, right? But we will touch on some other topics. You'll see a version of this chart in the museum, and sorry about the table and the numbers, but it's important to understand the magnitude of what we're talking about. And this table lists the production of all the combatants. And what you see up at the top, 1939, U.S. produced a little over 2,000 aircraft. Despite being the home of the Wright brothers that invented it, but then you see very rapidly in the years 1942 through 44, a rapid increase in the total quantities of production. By 1944, the U.S. is producing more than all of the Allies put together, or more than the Axis. And that's that avalanche of production that we're going to talk about. But in addition to that, I've also put over on the side there the most produced aircraft of the major combatants. And so starting at the bottom, the venerable Bf-109, 34,000 of those produced in Germany. Spitfire, 20,000. The Sturmovik, 36,000 of those in the Soviet Union. But interestingly, the most produced aircraft by the United States is that B-24 heavy bomber, with 18,400 of those being produced. And so not only are the U.S. numbers higher than anybody else or even everybody else put together, but the very nature of the aircraft is different. Those numbers include tens of thousands of some of the most sophisticated, complex machines ever built up to that time. And so, not just the numbers, but also the types of aircraft that were built are impressive. And so my question to myself, right, working in this field, seeing how things work today, and looking at those kind of numbers was, how'd they do that? How did they produce, the heavy bombers that you see in the corner there in these kind of quantities? Well, I've got the answers for you. So that's what we're going to spend our time about. A little bit of background, but Franklin Roosevelt, he had to work the politics. He was able to get the country started early, right? So that always helps in doing a thing. Hired some great people, and then built the factories and the machinery, expanded the workforce, and then, yes, this all costs money, right? And the U.S. Was able to spend the kind of money to make this happen, and that is how it was done, and a preview of what we're going to talk about today. So just a little bit regarding background. The U.S. got into World War I, or the Great War as it was known at the time, a little bit late, and many of you will recognize this guy and that picture. That's, of course, Eddie Rickenbacker, the leading U.S. ace from World War I, credited with 26 kills. But that's not the important part of this picture. Notice the airplane behind him, right, that he flew during the war. Well, that's this French-built SPAD 13. And why, right? Well, because despite, again, being the home of the Wright brothers, no U.S. built aircraft would serve in Europe during World War I. Our mobilization wasn't capable of meeting the needs at the time. And so, back to those expectations, right? We weren't able to do it then. Another little bit of background, many of you will recognize the cartoon character down there, Little Orphan Annie and Daddy Warbucks. Well, Daddy Warbucks would first appear in the New York Daily News in September 1924. And I'm not a big fan of the series, but I understand he kind of goes back and forth. Sometimes he's a good guy, sometimes he's a bad guy, right? But that character reflects an attitude or a common belief that you'll still hear to this day. The perception was that industrialists, right, the capitalists, had unfairly profited from arms production in World War I, if not actually caused the war through their actions and the production of arms. And so that perception, right, politics, perception is reality, was prevalent in the 1920s and the run-up to World War II. A little bit more background. Of course, we had an army in 1939, 174,000 strength. That put us 19th in the world, behind Portugal and ahead of Bulgaria. To contrast, Germany would invade Poland with 2 million men. And so, very small army at the time. And of course, we really want to hear about the Air Corps. Strength of 26,000, 1,200 obsolete aircraft. And again, in contrast to Germany, in 1939, they would have 4,000 modern aircraft in their inventory in the Luftwaffe. So what do I mean by obsolete aircraft? Well, these are the state-of-the-art aircraft that the Army Air Corps was fielding in 1939. So you see the Curtiss P-36. A couple of these actually did sea combat in World War II with France and with Finland. Over on the right, the Boeing B-18 Bolo, too obsolete to fly bombing raids over Europe. We did lose some of these at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines. But by the time of U.S. entry into the war, this aircraft was considered only suitable for anti-submarine patrols. And so these would serve throughout the war, but not in the strategic bombing capability. And then at the bottom, Northrop A-17, actually considered too obsolete by the time of the U.S. entry into the war to ever see combat. So this is where the U.S. Army was at the beginning of the war in Europe. Now, we mentioned heavy bombers. 1939, we did have the B-17. They were just getting started in production, but 23 of them, right? So contrast that to what Roosevelt is going to be looking for. I know politics, right? It's the season. Believe it or not, there was politics back in the 1930s. This guy, FDR, well, he got reelected for an unprecedented third term in 1940 and was just coming out of the implementation of his New Deal programs. He previously enjoyed a majority in both houses of Congress, but in 1940 he lost his majority in the House, and so divided politics. And he's got plans, but of course he's also got opposition. Right? The Republican Party at the time, they didn't really think too highly of the New Deal policies. They were interested in banking and industry, and who didn't like those policies very much. So kind of naturally set to oppose Roosevelt's policies, as well as these guys. Of course, you recognize Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, but these were two of the key individuals leading the America First movement. And this was a group that wanted to keep the U.S. out of foreign conflicts, right? Coming out of the First World War, isolationism was very much a thing. And well, those are tough guys to argue with, right? Probably the most famous aviator of the time and famous industrialist. And with them and Congress, Congress passed several neutrality acts. One specifically known as cash and carry. So with the war starting in Europe, if Great Britain wanted arms from the U.S., they had to pay for them with cash and pick them up from the U.S. and take them home. And with the war underway, that challenged Europe. That made it very difficult for Britain to get into the war or to have U.S. support during the war. Believe it or not, there was a very active Communist Party of the United States. During the Great Depression, this organization actually had dreams that the U.S. might have a communist revolution, or at least a very socialist government might take place in the U.S. And so FDR, not only does he have opposition on the right, but he's got opposition on the left, right? They would very much, well, first of all, remember 1939, the Soviet Union is allied with Germany. And so their perception is, why should we be helping the capitalists, right? And the imperialists against the Soviet Union. So communist parties not only going to oppose getting involved in Europe or overseas, but they also would very much like to see the factories be nationalized and run by the government. And we'll see that's not really what Roosevelt has in mind. So what are you going to do, right? These things are real, and to implement policy, Roosevelt's got to deal with them. Well, a relatively new invention down there on the bottom right, the radio. By the late 1930s, these were common in people's houses, and offered Roosevelt a new opportunity, right, to take his message directly to the American people. So next step for Roosevelt is to get started early. This is what he's dreaming of. Fleets of bombers that we can perhaps provide to our allies to carry the war into Germany and keep the U.S. out of the war, or if needed, be ready for our use. And he's carried out a series of speeches known as the Fireside Chat. One in particular I'm going to draw your attention to is the Fireside Chat on National Defense from May 26, 1940. So just to give you a little background, right? May of 1940, the U.S. isn't in the war. The Battle of France has been raging for a few weeks, and in fact, Calais has fallen. The Battle of Dunkirk is about to start, right, with the evacuation. So things are not going well in Europe, right? It looks like Germany's going to succeed in knocking France out of the war. What Roosevelt talks about in this speech, it's both of the speeches I'm going to bring to your attention are relatively long. They're about a little over 30 minutes, but he's going to talk about the German invasion and then U.S. preparations for 1933, since 1933. And what you're going to hear is what Roosevelt believes is needed for the future and how to go about doing that. So with a little technical miracle here.
The aviation industry to produce modern planes has been tremendously increased. In this past year, more than double. But that capacity is still inadequate. The government, working with industry, is determined to increase that capacity to meet our needs. We intend to harness the efficient machinery of these manufacturers for the government's program of being able to get 50,000 planes a year. I will not hesitate at any moment to ask for additional funds when they are required. In this era of swift, mechanized warfare, we all have to remember that what is modern today and up to date, what is efficient and practical, becomes obsolete and outworn tomorrow. Even while the production line turns out airplanes, new airplanes are being designed on the drafting table. Even as a cruiser slides down the launching way, plans for improvement, plans for increased efficiency in the next model are taking shape in the blueprints of designers. Every day's fighting in Europe, on land, on sea, and in the air, discloses constant changes in methods of warfare. We are constantly improving and redesigning, testing new weapons, learning the lessons of the moment, seeking to produce in accordance with the latest that the brains of science can conceive. Yes, we are calling upon the resources, the efficiency and the ingenuity of American manufacturers of war material of all kinds, airplanes and tanks and guns and ships, and all the hundreds of products that go into this material. The government of the United States itself manufactures few of the implements of war. Private industry will continue to be the source of most of this material. And private industry will have to be speeded up to produce it at the rate and the efficiency called for by the needs of the time. I know that private business cannot be expected to make all of the capital investments required for expansions of plants and factories and personnel which this program calls for at once. It would be unfair to expect industrial corporations or their investors to do this when there is a chance that a change in international affairs may stop or curtail orders a year or two hence. Therefore, the government of the United States stands ready to advance the necessary money to help provide for the enlargement of factories, the establishment of new plants, the employment of thousands of necessary workers, the development of new sources of supply for the hundreds of raw materials required, the development of quick mass transportation of supply, our purpose not only to speed up production, but to increase the total facilities of the nation in such a way that they can be further enlarged to meet emergencies of the future.
Well, thank you for bearing with that. And I know a little bit of a long quote, but the opportunity to let you hear Franklin Roosevelt tell you his plan verbatim, hear a voice from the past, it was irresistible. So thanks again. Just before that speech, about 10 days before, Roosevelt had asked Congress in his budget for $1.25 billion to start producing those 50,000 aircraft. Now, at the time, that was just a huge number. And in fact, 50,000 airplanes was considered such a huge number at the time that people literally wouldn't argue with him about the number. I mean, it was just, just a ridiculous amount. It's more airplanes than had ever been produced in the U.S. Altogether since the Wright brothers. And so kind of basically considered just a crazy goal. But he also told you how he's going to go about doing that, right? Industry is going to build those airplanes. And this was a deliberate decision of how to go about doing that, not have the government try and build them with civil servants. And the other thing you also heard, he's going to bring people from industry into the government to help the government do that. And again, at the time, this is kind of crazy stuff, right? What do you mean you're going to bring people in from industry? So I have another small clip. This one's shorter, I promise. From another speech known as the Arsenal of Democracy speech. And this one was delivered December 29th, 1940. So again, the U.S. isn't in the war. What's going on in Europe? Well, the Battle of Britain is pretty much over. The Blitz is underway, right? So German bombers are bombing London at night. Italy, well, they've invaded Greece and they're not doing very well. And that'll be a whole nother campaign. But just before this speech, British heavy bombers had bombed the German industrial city of Mannheim. And so again, this is what's in FDR's mind. A little more background, September 27th, 1940, an agreement was reached between Italy, Germany, and Japan. And FDR is very much worried about Axis expansion, what might happen in the world if the Axis is successful in their conquests of China and Great Britain, and that people that believe that the U.S. Can stay out of the war are not thinking correctly. Ultimately, the U.S. will get involved. And so his plan is to hopefully keep the U.S. out of the war by aiding Great Britain. And so that's what he wants to do. And we'll just play again a brief clip.
Be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war.
So shorter clip, but put forward the title of the talk, or what this whole topic is known at. So another great opportunity to let you guys hear that. He'll go on in the speech to talk about protecting the rights of workers, discouraging strikes, and also discouraging lockouts. Now, coming out of the Great Depression, there's a lot of tension between business and workers, and the labor perceives the ramp up of U.S. production as an opportunity to make up for the losses that they suffered during the Great Depression. And so there's definitely tension in there. But what Roosevelt is looking for is cooperation between the government, industry, and labor. And well, the reviews from overseas were a little mixed. There's an Adolf Hitler quote. But it goes back to that original quote from Knudsen, right? Yeah, he's being a little flippant, but even at this date, has no idea what's coming. Now, if you want to hear some more fireside chats over in the home front, I know people don't wander back in there as often as they should, but there is a little setup of a living room and a fireside chat going on over in the museum. But remember, Roosevelt is asking Congress for the money and an industry, almost a year, over 6 months before the U.S. is getting into the war. So definitely starting early. As a result of these speeches, Roosevelt was able to get a policy change with Congress to allow what they called Lend-Lease, and that was passed in March of 1941. But the way this worked, rather than the cash and carry, where combatants would have to buy their arms, in this case the U.S. would spend government money to build arms, and then we would lend them to people. And then in theory they would pay us back for the use of the equipment afterwards. But this allowed the U.S. to start ramping up production and start supporting our allies or would-be allies in the conflict overseas. So P-40, or in Commonwealth service, the Kitty Hawk, and no, I don't recommend riding the wing like that, but we were able to get some of these over to Great Britain, as well as a few dozen of what the RAF called the Fortress, right? Those B-17 heavy bombers. We were able to start getting those. And then with the Soviet Union's entry into the war on the Allied side, the venerable P-39, which I know had a rough reputation in the US, but the Soviets really loved this airplane. And of course, those were all provided in Lend-Lease. Now, to kind of jump ahead to the answer, yeah, the US pretty much didn't get reimbursed for any of this after the war. But we were able to help keep the Allies in and start using our industrial power against the Axis powers. All right, Roosevelt mentioned it, bringing people from industry into the government, and this fella is key, right? You want to know who won World War II? Again, you need to mention this guy. Lieutenant General William, known as Big Bill Knudsen, and we'll talk about how he got to be a lieutenant general. But he was an immigrant from Denmark, came over in the previous century, 1879, eventually got a job working for Henry Ford on the production line, worked for Ford for 10 years. Knudsen came up with the idea of, hey, why don't we come out with a new model car, maybe once a year or so. And Henry Ford didn't want to hear anything about it. He was making Model Ts, changing the world, and this led to a falling out between Knudsen and Ford. So Knudsen, he wandered over across the way to General Motors, and they put him in charge of Chevrolet. He managed to fix their production line. He was able to use flexible production techniques on the line, and that allowed him to start coming out with a new model every year. In the 1920s, very rapidly surpassed Ford in total sales and production, and as a result, Henry Ford actually had to end production of the Model T and come up with a more modern car to compete with Chevrolet. So, May of 1941, Roosevelt reaches out to Knudsen, says, would you come into the government and help me start producing aircraft, and in particular heavy bombers? To his credit, Knudsen left a $300,000 a year job remember, it's 1941. That's a lot of money back then. To come head what was called the Office of Production Management, so an office within the government. And what was first on his mind was, again, get excited, machine tools, right? The long lead item in production. Before you can produce anything, you need to build the machines to build the machines. And there's a picture up there of a giant press operated by Consolidated. And well, you don't want to wait for the war to start before you start building those machines. And so Knudsen was able to get the government and industry to start making those investments before the U.S. got engaged in the war. After the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, the Office of Production Management turned into the War Production Board, and in January of 1942, Bill Knudsen went from civilian to 3-star general. Only time in history that's ever happened, but the perception was he was having trouble getting the War Department and the Navy to listen to him. So they booted him upstairs to head that up. The War Production Board would actually be run by this guy, Don Nelson. Now, Don Nelson left a job as the executive vice president of Sears, Roebuck and Company. And, well, there might be some younger people out there. Okay, back in the day, Sears, they had a catalog, you could order stuff out of it. They were the world's largest retailer with stores in every significant city around the country. So if you want to think of them today, imagine a combination of Amazon and Walmart. And they would be the world's largest retailer into the 1980s. Well, Don Nelson ran that operation, and Roosevelt reached out and grabbed him to come into the government to help the government figure out how to distribute the huge quantities of production that he was looking for. So what did these guys do? They didn't make things themselves, right? They coordinated and they set priorities. So you can imagine if you were an aircraft manufacturer in 1941 and you got a big contract to build airplanes, the first thing you're going to do is send your purchasing manager out to secure all of the aluminum and raw materials you're going to need. If everybody does that at once, then there'll be a sudden shortage of aluminum. Prices might go up in a bidding war, and not everybody's going to get what they want. So, War Production Board, Nelson, Knudsen, they're going to get industry together and talk about who really needs what when, figure out how much they can make it all happen. You don't get it all on the first day. You got to spread that out. And if absolutely necessary, start setting priorities of, okay, we can't build everything we want to build. These are the most important. Those are least important. And before this time, that would be collusion, right? Getting industry together to talk about who's going to make what at what kind of prices. But this is the change that these guys implemented and how they started making this happen. They would be joined by a couple dozen other gentlemen known as the $1-a-year men. And what was important, these guys were all rich. They were heads of industry, but they wanted to establish that they worked for the government. And so they would have a nominal salary of $1 a year, right, their employees. Of course, they didn't give up their stock options on the side, so don't feel too bad for them. But this was new and kind of radical to have people from industry come in and help the government set the policies for their production. But this really played a huge role in that miracle of production that we know about. Okay, another famous face that you may not be familiar with, but an example of the kind of people that Roosevelt's talking about. Henry Kaiser. Let's see. Yeah, he started a highway building business in 1914 and was one of the companies that helped build the Hoover Dam. Growing up in Las Vegas, it's a big thing. It's concrete. It's very impressive for the Great Depression. But he was also an early adopter on technology, the kinds of things we're familiar with, Caterpillar, right, tractors, and cement machines and steamrollers. And by doing those, he was very successful in the road building business. Well, as part of World War II, he would end up building 4 shipyards, lots of concrete, roads, paving, all of that, mostly on the West Coast. But in those shipyards, he would build Liberty ships. And literally, we would build Liberty ships faster than the Germans could sink them. Average of one of these ships every 45 days coming out of his shipyards using modular construction. As a bit of a stunt, they actually produced one of these ships in a day to just kind of prove that they could do it. So another one of those people that you should remember who helped win the war. Mentioned industry across the board. I've got a few examples. The list is too long to go through every one, so if I miss your favorite company, please forgive me. But William Boeing, right? Most of these guys are going to name their companies after themselves. Up in Seattle, he got started in the lumber business, but founded his company and would build those B-17 heavy bombers, 16,000 of them, by the way, by the end of the war. Lockheed, also named for the founders, the brothers Lockheed. In fact, they phoneticized their name because they got tired of people not being able to pronounce it. But by this time, taken over by Robert Gross, and they would be famous down in Burbank with the P-38 and building those during the war. Kelly Johnson and his engineering work. North American, Dutch Kindleberger. But in 1933, GM had bought his company. He was a 10th grade dropout, World War I fighter pilot, flight instructor, studied engineering, and most famous for designing the P-51 in 4 months and building 42,000 aircraft during the war. Seversky, he founded Republic Aviation, World War I Imperial Russian aviator, lost a leg during the war, but that company would build the P-47, and of course, including the one at our museum here. Curtiss Wright, this is a company combining 2 early aviation pioneers, the Wright airplane company, originally founded by the Wright brothers, and then their competitor, Glenn Curtiss. Curtiss would invent the aileron as a way to avoid the Wright brothers' patent on wing warping and the invention of aircraft, and that would lead to a huge dispute over intellectual property. In fact, it's part of why the U.S. wasn't able to produce aircraft in World War I. But that would be settled in 1918. The companies would be merged, and then by World War II, Wright would focus on producing engines. That was one of the key inventions that the Wright brothers had to come up with their own engine. And Curtiss would build airframes. Run by a race car driver, Guy Vaughan, but they would build the P-40, the SB-2C that recently was restored at the museum, would be built by them. Grumman, run by Leroy Grumman, a mechanical engineer from Cornell University, also a naval aviator from World War I, studied at MIT, test pilot. He would basically build all of the airplanes that the Navy wanted, right? The Cat series, the Wildcat, the Tiger Cat, and the TBF would all be built by Grumman. So this is what Roosevelt was talking about when he mentioned that industry will build our aircraft. But of course, it wasn't just aircraft and the aviation industry. GM and Ford and Detroit in general would fully convert from building cars, automobiles for consumers, to building military equipment, trucks, tanks, aircraft parts. Detroit played a huge role in this miracle of production. Bethlehem Steel, in addition, of course, to building steel, they would build 1,100 ships during the war. GE, 300,000 of those turbo superchargers that are key to the performance of those high-altitude bombers and fighters, as well as a bunch of other stuff. DuPont, inventors of nylon, parachutes during the war, but also a key player on the Manhattan Project. Westinghouse, parts, Alcoa, all the aluminum for all of those aircraft. And again, sorry if I didn't mention your favorite company. But basically, anybody that was in the industrial business at the time of World War II converted their factories over to the production of war material. At the bottom, bang box, kind of the formula for success that Knudsen came up with. Basically, let industry figure out how to increase their production. And so while the War Production Board would coordinate, deconflict, set priorities, they did not get into the nitty-gritty of where you're going to get your parts and supplies. They let all of the companies figure that out on their own. And that was a significant bit of policy that you heard in those Roosevelt quotes. His deliberate decision to let industry produce the war material as opposed to having government do it. So a bit more into the how. Before the war, arms, other than aircraft, were produced in arsenals and Navy shipyards by civil servants. They would build the arms that the Army needed. Aircraft, they were a little too new, and so they had never really been incorporated into the arsenal system, except for the one exception that proves the rule, right? The Navy had trouble getting industry to build airplanes for the Navy in World War I, and so they would build their own aircraft factory. But other than that, aircraft were built by industry. And in the 1920s and 30s, this is how they did it, in small batches. Right? If you got a big contract in the 1930s for 50 or 100 airplanes, that was huge. That was enough to basically make your company. So picture here of production going on before the war, right? Winter of 1941 at Curtiss-Wright. And the way this works, you see aircraft in various stages of production, kind of wherever there's space. And then you can just see up in the corner there, the upper left for you, the handful of workers up there, about 7 or 8 of them. And it looks like it's engine day, right? So everybody's doing something on the engines. Maybe tomorrow will be wing day, and everybody will move over and install wings. The way this works, well, there's very skilled master craftsmen up there that know all about the airplane and where everything goes. And if there's a special way the bolts on the engine have to be tightened, well, they know that, right? Probably not written down. The expertise is up in their head. And those master craftsmen with some journeymen and some apprentices are going to move around the factory, go from plane to plane, and build out that production. And this works great. If you've got a contract for 50 or 100 airplanes in a year, build them, 5 a month, and you're great. And so a lot of my experience is in the space business. This would be a huge production run for the space business in most of what I've seen. It works, like I say, works fine. A little bit interesting things happen between airplane 2 and airplane 49. These guys are going to get better. They're going to learn things. The chances that airplane 49 is identical to airplane 2 are pretty limited because, like I say, they're going to get better. But the real challenge for this is if you ask an outfit like this to increase production, right? Well, if you want them to double their production rate, they can put the guys on overtime, they can start hiring, but they're not going to be able to hire those master craftsmen, especially if everybody else is ramping up production. And it takes years to train those guys for everything they need to know. And so doubling, sure, you could probably do that. But Roosevelt asking for 10 times the kind of production rates from every individual company. And so what's the answer? Well, during World War II, it was the assembly line. Now, an absolute prerequisite for making this work is standardization. The parts that are going to go be assembled on the assembly line literally have to be interchangeable. They have to be exactly the same to a very high degree of tolerance. Early leader in this was the Springfield Armory. They started standardizing rifle parts in the 19th century. Before that, rifles were handcrafted. Each one was unique. Springfield Armory came up with the idea of building them to be the same so that you could take a piece off one rifle and it would work on another rifle. And this is an absolute prerequisite to make this work. Other early leaders, Singer, the sewing machine company, and Colt Firearms, they worked on the assembly line concept. But the big adopter is Henry Ford. He would apply this concept to the manufacturing of automobiles and lead to an industrial revolution. So just to quote him on how this works, the man who places a part does not fasten it. The man who puts in a bolt does not put on the nut. The man who puts on the nut does not tighten it. Every piece of work in the shop moves. It may move on hooks or on overhead chains. Frankly, doesn't sound all that much fun, right? To stand on the assembly line and put the nut on the bolt and do that all day, every day, as the pieces come past you. But you see a picture there of workers on a Ford assembly line in 1913. And using this technique, Ford was able to build Model Ts for the unheard of price of $500 each. And in addition, he was able to then pay his workers a crazy salary, twice the industry average of $2 an hour, and instituted a 40-hour work week. And so revolutionized the building of auto parts. So one of the answers of how did the U.S. manage those kind of production lines is by applying the Ford assembly line concept to the production of aircraft. Now, one of the things this allows, and it was kind of a dispute at the time, to make this work, you've got to break that job down into individual tasks, right, that the workers can perform. But once you've done that, then it's relatively easy to train a person to do that one specific little job, right? If your job is to put on 6 nuts, that doesn't take a lot of training to learn how to do that. And you don't need nearly as many of those master craftsmen and journeymen to start production in large quantities. One of the best examples of this is a factory that Ford built in Detroit, known as Willow Run. It has a more formal name, Air Force Plant 31. The government actually paid for this plant. And Ford came to Roosevelt with the idea of building a factory specifically designed to build these B-24 heavy bombers. Now at the time, Consolidated was building these at the crazy rate of 12 per month. And the Ford plan was to build a factory that was capable of building one of these bombers every hour. And that's what you see here. The guy put in charge of this, the president of Ford at the time, Edsel Ford, Henry Ford's one and only son, a picture of him in 1921. He would literally work himself to death in 1943 getting this factory up and running. Pass away during the war of what was believed to be stomach cancer, but working right up to the end. So what you see here, a mile-long factory, assembly line, and every hour those airplanes are going to move forward. And so the workers are not going to move from airplane to airplane. If your job is riveting a panel, you're going to rivet your panel. So they've broken the task down to about an hour's worth of work, and then that airplane's going to move forward, and the next one's going to be there for you to start riveting. Now, part of the secret here is in 1942, as they got going, among the first 30,000 workers in what would be a 60,000 person factory, less than 400 of them had previous aircraft experience. So we can very rapidly bring workers in and teach them what they need to know, and then start building aircraft. So notice those giant 4-engine Pratt & Whitney R-1830s, 4 per aircraft. We're going to build an airplane an hour. That means just about 100 of those engines have to show up every day. They have to be moved into position and ready to go. And of course, it's not just engines, it's all the other parts. So an enormous orchestra of pieces coming together in the right place at the right time to make this all work. But by 1944, they had this all up and running, and were able to produce 4,600 B-24s, plus numerous kits. In other words, all the parts of an airplane, and they managed to better their one plane an hour in practice, 55 minutes to produce one of these B-24 bombers. And of course, it wasn't just Willow Run, right? And it wasn't just airplanes. Across all of the U.S. industry, the automobile guys knew how to do this. Some other industry knew how to do it. But in plant after plant, adopted this assembly line process of mass production. And that really is one of the key answers to, how did the U.S. do this? And it's through the assembly line and mass production. Okay, another bit of the how, or a challenge. 11 million, mostly men, are going to end up coming into the U.S. Armed Forces and serving overseas. Well, that's your workforce, right? And they're leaving. So the U.S., more than perhaps anybody else, deliberately sought out new sources of workers. And you see their poster girl up there, Rosie the Riveter. That's from a May 29th, 1943 Saturday Evening Post, painted by Norman Rockwell. So a little more than a year into the war, and this is already an icon, right? That's how fast we started tapping new sources of workers. And so a couple pictures here of some actual Rosie the Riveters working in the aircraft industry, and an African-American woman, right? Now, before World War II, this kind of work was not really open to women or African-Americans at all. Henry Ford, a little bit of an early adopter, but there's a war on. Men and women deliberately recruited to come into the factories in very large numbers. By the end of the war, we'd add 8 million women to the workforce. And to answer a question before it's asked, another big part of the how, The companies and the government provided 24/7 daycare. We can do it when we need it, right? Figured it out at the time. In addition, 17 million Americans would relocate, mostly from the urban South, or the rural South, into the what we call now the Rust Belt in Detroit and to the far west. To give you a feel for that, that's over 10% of the American populace is going to up and move for wartime jobs. And so a huge change in the workforce. And again, back to how. How was it done? We exploited sources of workers that hadn't been used before. Okay, another little bit of a challenge. Kind of the perception is this was all done in patriotic fervor, and we didn't have any challenges with labor. But yes, we did. Coming out of the part of the New Deal, Fair Labor Standards Acts of 1935 and 1938 gave employees crazy rights like overtime pay if you worked more than 40 hours, the right to unionize, and based on this, and again that perception that labor needed to recover their losses in the Great Depression, 1941 was actually a near record year for strikes in the U.S. So a couple of examples. This is a big Ford strike at the Rouge plant in April of 1941. Turned into a racial conflict as well. To resolve this, Henry Ford would have to agree to allow his workers to unionize. And this was a big concession on his part. He basically had fought unionization tooth and nail. Another big strike occurred in June at North American, that plant I mentioned, the United Auto Workers wildcat strike. FDR would send in the National Guard to break that one up. This conflict, well, it would start changing with some key events. The first one there, June 22nd, 1941, maybe not a date that jumps out at everybody, but that's the German invasion of the Soviet Union. And of course, key factor in the overall war effort, but also change in perception. Remember that American Communist Party? Well, with Germany now invading the Soviet Union is an ally, or at least is on our side. And so started reducing labor unrest due to that perception. And then with the Japanese attack in 1941, very much the patriotism started playing a role. But believe it or not, labor unrest would continue throughout the war with limited, mostly wildcat strikes. One of the policies that really helped was this E for Excellence program. If you were a weapons manufacturer during the war, you could get one of these banners, and they were very much prized for meeting production and quality goals. But another criteria was labor relations, and so big motivator to try and work some of this stuff out during the war. In the end, if you want all of this to happen, you got to spend money, and the U.S. Was very willing to do that. Again, apologize for the table, but you'll see the total over at the side there, $106 billion in 1944 money spent on munitions during the war. That's by the U.S. That's about a third of the total cost of the war, right? So I haven't included salaries and other stuff like that. And about a third of that total expenditure was on aircraft. They were the big ticket items. Just to give you a sense of that number, of course it's in 1944 dollars, that's about 1.9 trillion today, or a bit more than the total government budget in 2024. So this year's budget was spent on munitions during World War II. And kind of the perception is that the US basically threw money at it. Not really quite the perception. Yes, the US spent more than the other allies put together, about half of the total Allied expenditure. Before that, the US was able to produce 2/3 of all of the military equipment that the Allies used. So yes, our factories weren't getting bombed, but using those techniques of mass production, the US actually got a pretty good deal. We got state-of-the-art weapons in huge quantities and ended up dollars per bullet doing very well in its procurement during the war. How did we finance all that? Well, a big chunk of it was war bonds. So the American people invested money in their government and in freedom to help finance all of that spending. Overall, of course, it wasn't just aircraft, right? Here's a picture of a production line in Detroit at the Arsenal, building M4 Shermans in great quantity on using that production line technique. Ships, shipyards, huge numbers of ships built. In fact, there's the gee-whiz statistics for U.S. production across the board, from 86,000 tanks to 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Just an incredible achievement in wartime production. And as these arms were picked up by our soldiers and used by our allies, that tide really became overwhelming and is, again, a key reason why the Allies prevailed in World War II. So how was it done? I mentioned this at the beginning. FDR worked the politics. He got started early. He brought knowledgeable people from industry into the government and allowed industry that knew how to build things in large quantities to figure out how to do that under contract to the government. Built the factories and the machineries. We expanded the workforce using people that had historically not been able to do that kind of work, and of course spent the money for the munitions and the factory and all of the machinery. As a result, of course, the Allies prevailed and won the war. Sorry, this one might be a tough picture for some of you, but most of those aircraft would end up in the scrapyard and after the war. To dispel a common perception, no, they were not turned into beer cans. Beer in aluminum cans would not appear until 1958 and not be common until the 1960s. So you can just nib that one in the butt right away. But one of the effects was a huge change in the US economy. Before World War II, the economic cycle, the thing that led to the Great Depression, was driven by the needs of business for major capital equipment like locomotives and steamships, right? That was the driver of the business cycle. After World War II, that increase in productive capacity would be turned over to the manufacture of consumer goods, not beer cans. But other consumer goods, all the things that you find in your home today, right? Washers, automobiles, dryers, now cell phones. That's what drives the modern US economy, not the industrial goods that drove it before. So fundamental change in the US economy. After the war, this guy, famous General Eisenhower, US president, would warn the country about the military congressional industrial complex. Now he left Congress out of it, politics again. But that did not exist before World War II, but it does exist now, and FDR was concerned about it, still out there. Remember Henry Kaiser, the road builder and shipyard? One of the things he did, in part to get around the wage and price restrictions, but also because working in a defense plant in 1942 was actually more dangerous than being in military service. He started a healthcare system for his workers. So a little fringe benefit out there, but also get them patched up, get them back on the line. And this would turn into one of the modern major providers of healthcare, Kaiser Permanente, right? But that was originally the name of his concrete company. It was Permanente. So fundamental change in workforce, right? Most of the things we think of as fringe benefits now came out of World War II. And a kind of a random picture off the internet, but this is what our workplaces look like today, right? Before World War II, very rare to see a person of color in an office job, much less women, but now very common. And of course, it wasn't just World War II, but certainly a big factor in making that change to our workforces. That's what I have for you today. If you're not saturated on industrial policy, some recommended sources up here. The FDR library is all online. It's huge. If you want to hear the full text of those speeches, all of his speeches that were recorded are available live, and you just click the button and you can hear FDR talk on many topics over his long history, as well as many other resources. A couple of books that served as my sources and you might like for additional reading. If you're a Ford person, then I recommend The Arsenal of Democracy. It's all about the Willow Run plant and Ford. For you GM people, you're going to want to read Freedom's Forge. It's the opposite side of the story from the GM, but it mainly talks about Big Bill Knudsen and Kaiser and the other industrialists that made this happen. And if that's not enough, in the middle, a topic that I found fascinating, Engineers of Victory, how we solved engineering problems during the war, like how do you find submarines and hunt them down. And so I can recommend all of these. With that, thank you very much for coming out during the holiday season.